Hi, this is Jennifer Cook from the University of Birmingham, and I'd like to start my talk today by saying happy 75th birthday EPS. I've had a lot of help and support from the EPS over the years and have benefited greatly from the multiple meetings that they have every year. And so it's really nice today to have this opportunity to say a big thank you and a big happy birthday. So my gift to you, EPS, is this talk entitled Flexible Mechanisms for Social and Individual Learning. So social learning, what is it? Well, social learning concerns learning from, observation of, or interaction with others. And this stands in contrast to what we might refer to as individual learning, or learning via trial and error, or figuring things out for yourself. Now, social learning is a topic that has been of interest to academics from a wide variety of different fields. Psychology, of course, but also ecology, evolutionary biology, and even philosophy. And this is because social learning is thought to be of key importance in cumulative cultural evolution. The argument is that by learning from other people, we can avoid having to reinvent the wheel, and thus each new generation can make considerable advances on the achievements of previous generations. Now, in the social learning literature, there has long been what I think is a really interesting debate between two different schools of thought. Theorists in the domain-specific camp argue that living in social groups has favoured the evolution of social learning, and thus there are special mechanisms for social learning that are adaptations for dealing with the pressures of group living. So in other words, at some point in evolutionary history, we had to develop special mechanisms for social learning that are distinct from those mechanisms that we use for learning from our own individual experience. Domain general theorists, on the other hand, argue that all learning, including social learning, can be driven by the operation of a few general learning principles. So in other words, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about individual learning or social learning, but we're still using the same general mechanisms, for example, principles of associative learning or instrumental conditioning. When cognitive neuroscientists have looked in the brain at the mechanisms supporting social and individual learning, some of them have found evidence consistent with the domain general view. So in other words, some studies have found that the same brain areas and the same, generally dopamine-mediated computations are involved in both social and individual learning. However, it's also the case that some studies have found dissociable neural pathways for social and individual learning, and other types of dissociations between these two types of learning. These studies are consistent with the domain-specific view because they find special pathways or special mechanisms for specifically social learning. So regarding the question of whether there are special mechanisms for social learning, evidence from cognitive neuroscience is mixed. In this talk, what I'd like to start with is to zoom into some of these dissociations between social and individual learning, and I'm even going to show you some examples of dissociations from my own lab. In the second part of the talk, however, I'm going to look at some alternative explanations. In particular, I will argue that in most studies that have dissociated social and individual learning, the individual source of information is primary and the social source is secondary. And therefore I'm going to argue that dissociations between individual and social might be dissociations between primary and secondary. And finally, I'm going to try to show how this idea actually helps us to resolve conflicting findings in the neuroscience literature. To help me to give you some examples of dissociations between social and individual learning, I need to first explain a classic task that is often used in this literature. This is a task that was initially developed by Tim Behrens and Matthew Rushworth and other colleagues at the University of Oxford and has been adapted in various ways and used by different groups around the world. On each trial in this task, participants are required to make a choice between a blue and a green box in order to win some points. Before they make their choice, they see a thin red frame representing social information. In some experiments by some lab groups, this represents information from a confederate. In others, including ours, it represents the most popular choice selected by a group of participants who previously played the task. Participants know that the correct answer will flip between blue and green, and that the social information will flip between phases where it's very useful and phases where it's not very useful. Thus, participants know that they must use their individual experience of reward outcomes to learn from trial to trial about the blue and the green boxes, and they must use the feedback to learn from trial to trial about the veracity of the social information. In other words, participants must engage in both individual and social learning. A number of years ago, we used this task to investigate the way in which personality traits linked to popularity and leadership relate to social and individual learning. We found that socially dominant people, who naturally tend to emerge as popular social leaders in the workplace, are more optimal in their social learning compared to people who are low in social dominance. And, most interestingly, I think, we showed that social dominance was a significantly better predictor of social compared to individual learning. In other words, we showed that social dominance dissociates social from individual learning. More recently, in a double-blind placebo-controlled study, we showed that the dopamine and noradrenaline transporter blocker, methylphenidate, impacted on individual learning, but not on social learning. More specifically, when participants had taken this dopaminergic drug, they were better able to adapt to the volatility of the individual information, those blue and green boxes, meaning that when they were in a relatively stable phase, for example, when the blue box was rewarded for a long period of time, they had a low learning rate, and then when they were in a very changeable, volatile period, where the correct answer was flipping between blue and green, their learning rate shot up. And we found that this was true both when we fitted a Rescorla-Wagner-style learning model to the data and also when we ran simpler win-stay-lose-shift type analyses. Importantly, however, the drug, methylphenidate, did not help participants learn about the volatility of the social information. So far, I have shown you two examples of dissociations between social and individual learning. Social dominance correlates with social but not individual learning, and methylphenidate affects individual but not social learning. So here we have patterns of data that are consistent with the idea that there are separate mechanisms for social and individual learning. And if I had longer to speak about this, I could show you similar examples from lab groups around the world. In this next part of the talk, however, what I would really like to do is to explore an alternative explanation. And I would like to argue that in tasks like the one that I've shown you, the individual source is primary and the social source is secondary. And thus dissociations may comprise dissociations between learning from primary and secondary, not social and individual sources. So why do I think that the individual information is primary? Well, I think this is the case because in this task, these boxes, the blue and the green boxes, which comprise the individual information, appear first. They are highly salient, big colourful boxes as opposed to this thin red frame, and also the outcome information comes in the form of a small blue or green box, which primarily informs participants about whether the blue or green box was correct on that particular trial. And then, from this information, they can additionally infer whether the red frame therefore surrounds the correct or incorrect answer. So to summarise, the boxes comprise the primary source, because they appear first, they're highly salient, and they're in the same frame of reference as the outcome information. Now, going back to the methylphenidate study that I showed you previously, the pattern of results that I showed you could be a dissociation between individual and social learning, but it could also be a dissociation between learning from a primary source, the boxes, and from a secondary source, the thin red frame. Now, we reasoned that if we had a control task in which participants learned from a primary source and a secondary source, and neither of them were social in nature, and if we didn't see this same methylphenidate-driven dissociation on the control task, then we could be more confident that this pattern that you're looking at now represents a distinction between individual and social, not just primary and secondary. So we recruited a second group of participants, and these participants completed the same task. However, we told these people that the secondary source of information, the red frame, represented advice from a rigged system of roulette wheels, which sometimes produced helpful recommendations and sometimes produced recommendations that were not so helpful. So again, we told them that things were going to happen in phases to replicate the social version of the task. Here on this figure, I'm plotting the data from still the people that had the social cover story, but I'm just plotting this in a slightly different way now. So what I've done is to take the difference between the methylphenidate and placebo conditions. So now data points above the black dashed line represent a drug-induced boost to learning, and data points below the line represent a drug-induced impairment to learning. And just to remind you, in this group that thought the red frame showed social information, we saw that methylphenidate boosted individual, but it didn't boost social learning. We hoped that the roulette group would actually not show the same pattern of data, because if we saw that, then this would provide us with evidence that methylphenidate, it doesn't just dissociate any primary and secondary source of learning, but rather it specifically dissociates individual and social learning. However, as you can see from this figure, we did see that the roulette group showed the same pattern. So what we saw was that methylphenidate modulated individual learning from the primary source, but it did not modulate learning from the red frame, the secondary source. There was no significant interaction between drug, learning source and the social versus roulette cover story, and furthermore Bayesian statistics provided moderate support for the conclusion that the effect of the drug was the same for the social and the roulette groups. So by including this control task, we've shown that methylphenidate dissociates learning from primary and secondary sources of information. Now going back to our central debate, the data from our control task forces us to question the domain-specific view. This is because many studies that support this view have used a similar paradigm to the one that we've used, but without the control task, and therefore they could be showing dissociations not between individual and social learning, but rather between primary and secondary learning. So our data make us question the domain-specific view, but on the other hand, they don't actually provide positive evidence in favour of the domain general view. This is because in the experiment that I've just presented to you, we didn't actually see any effects of the drug on social learning at all. So we couldn't actually show that social and individual learning rely on common mechanisms. Interestingly, however, it follows from our work that if we could make the social source the primary source, then we should see an effect of dopaminergic drugs on social learning just like we do when the individual source is primary. In other words, if the domain general view is correct, both social and individual learning should be modulated by dopaminergic drugs when they are the primary source. To test this hypothesis, we developed a version of the social learning task in which the social information comprises the primary learning source. In this version, participants first saw social information, which appeared on the left or the right of the screen and comprised a highly salient big red box representing the majority choice of a social group. Participants had to decide whether they would go with or go against the social group. Participants then saw a thin green and a thin blue frame surround either the red box or not. And just like in the classic version of the task, participants were told that things happen in phases, such that sometimes they would be in a phase where going with the social information would lead to points, and other times they would be in a phase where going against the social information was correct. And similarly, there were phases where the blue frame indicated the correct answer and phases where the green frame indicated the correct answer. After making their final selection to go with the social information or not, they saw a tick or a cross, which primarily informed participants about whether going with the social information was correct. And from this, they could additionally infer whether the blue or the green frame was therefore correct. So in this version of the task, the social information is primary because it appears first on the screen, it is highly salient, and it is in the same frame of reference as the outcome information. To test our hypothesis, we recruited two groups of participants. One group played this new version of the task and another played the old version, where the individual information is the primary source. And in a double-blind placebo-controlled design, we used haloperidol, which is a dopamine D2 receptor antagonist, to perturb dopamine system functioning. To remind you, we hypothesized that haloperidol would perturb learning from primary sources, but not secondary sources. Indeed, we found that haloperidol perturbed learning from the primary source and not the secondary source. In other words, there was a significant drug by information source interaction, such that relative to placebo, haloperidol reduced the rate of learning from the primary source. Numerically, you can see in the figure that it also increased the rate of learning from the secondary source, but this was not a statistically significant effect. Most importantly, however, haloperidol affected learning from the primary source, irrespective of its social or individual nature. In other words, it didn't matter whether participants had played the new version of the task, where the social information is primary, or the old version of the task, where the individual information is primary. We always saw the effects of haloperidol on the primary and not on the secondary source of learning. Indeed, Bayesian statistics provided moderate to strong evidence in favour of the hypothesis that there was no drug by information by group interaction, where group denotes which version of the task participants have played. So, to summarise all of this information that I've given you in this short talk, I first presented some dissociations between social and individual learning. However, I then argued that these dissociations may represent differences between primary and secondary, not social and individual learning. And finally, I presented evidence that social and individual learning rely on common dopaminergic mechanisms when they are the primary source of learning. So to zoom back to our central debate, the final study that I presented comprises positive evidence to support the domain general view that both social and individual learning share common mechanisms. Furthermore, realising the importance of the primary versus secondary status of a learning source may also help us to resolve conflict in the literature. And I believe this to be the case because in studies that have shown that social learning relies upon the dopaminergic mechanisms that typically underpin individual learning, the social source has generally been the primary and in many cases the only source of information from which participants must learn. But in studies that have found different neural pathways for social and individual learning, social information has generally comprised a secondary additional source. We suggest that these neural pathways are actually not specialised for specifically social and individual learning, but rather they can process both social and non-social cues and can flexibly switch between the two depending on which cue is primarily relevant for the task at hand. So, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I'd like to finish by saying thank you to my lab group and to all of our many collaborators. Particular thanks go to Celia Hayes, Hanneke den Ouden and Roshan Cools, who played major roles in the development of these ideas and the first few experiments that I showed. The final experiment was led by Alicia Rybitsky with help from Bianca Schuster and Sophie Sowden, so huge thanks to them for all their hard work on this experiment. We are close to uploading a preprint of the final experiment, so if you're interested in that, then check out our website or tweet me or email me if you want me to send you a copy. And a final vote of thanks goes to all our many funders, without whom we wouldn't be able to do any of this work, and this includes the EPS. So thank you very much, EPS.